Well, it's a great pleasure to be here and introduce Vincent Intondi, and also to welcome all of you for coming on this cold and windy spring afternoon. Vincent Intondi is an associate professor of history at Montgomery College in Tacoma Park, Maryland. He is also the founder of the Center for Black Studies at Montgomery. He received his PhD in history in American University in 2009 after completing a BA in economics at SUNY Potsdam and an MA in history at SUNY Oswego. In addition to his primary appointment at Montgomery, Professor Intondi holds a position at American University. In the very year in which he received his PhD, he was named the Director of Research for American University's Nuclear Studies Institute in Washington, D.C. As a Director of Research, Professor Intondi annually teaches in Hiroshima and Nagasaki alongside atomic bomb survivors, nuclear policy experts, and various dignitaries. Prior to teaching at Montgomery College, Professor Intondi was an associate professor of history at Seminole State College in Florida. In 2011, he was named Distinguished Visiting Scholar of African American Studies at Rollins College, where he co-created the Harry T. Moore Legacy Program to honor and sustain the work of one of the early founders of the civil rights movement. As his position at various colleges and universities makes clear, he has had, in the very short time since his PhD, a fertile effect on the institutions where he has taught. Professor Intondi is a regular contributor to the Huffington Post and has appeared publicly alongside Benjamin Jealous, Bobby Seale, Julian Bond, Tom Hayden, Daniel Ellsberg, Peter Kosnick, and Oliver Stone. Most important for us this afternoon, he is the author of the book African Americans Against the Bomb, Nuclear Weapons, Colonialism, and the Black Freedom Movement, published by Stanford University Press this winter. And Cole Harrison has kindly bought copies of the books for us, if you don't already have one. I first became aware of this book several months before it appeared in print, when I happened to see an advertisement in the Boston Review. I can honestly say that I have seldom had the electric response to a book announcement that I had when I saw this one. Why was that? Here's a partial answer. I think anyone who works on nuclear weapons must see and must live with the dreadful silence about our own genocidal weapons that reign in this country. Our newspapers don't talk about them. Our governors don't talk about them. Our population doesn't talk about them. Yet every once in a while, I would see that someone was saying something, and not just saying something, but doing something. And not just doing something, but doing something that was about 5 standard deviations away from what the rest of us were doing. When Jesse Jackson ran for president in 1988, he made no first use, a plank in his presidential platform, a phenomenally courageous thing to do. Most Americans then, like most Americans today, don't know that we have a presidential first use policy. But here was someone not simply pointing it out, not simply saying it was wrong, but saying that its elimination would be a major objective of his presidency. His announcement was the headline that day in the LA Times. I had a similar experience when I had a very small part in a legal case against presidential first use that involved congressional plaintiffs. Who stepped forward as the plaintiff in the case? Ron Dellums, the African-American congressman from the 9th District of California. In both cases, I felt I was seeing something miraculous, but I didn't know what I was seeing. And what I was seeing was the small tip of an iceberg, and Professor Intondi's book reveals the massive iceberg of anti-nuclear resistance and responsibility. So I was thrilled when the Mahindra Humanities Center and the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research invited Professor Intondi to speak. The Mellon series on violence has had an array of important conferences and an array of marvelous solo speakers, Steve Pinker, Etienne Balabar, Bianca Jagger, And Vincent Intondi, then younger than most, now joins them. Finally, I want to say that I'm glad this lecture is occurring on April 20th. 1 week from today in New York begins the review of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Article 6 of the treaty requires the nuclear states to disarm. And you can read more about this in tomorrow's Crimson by an op-ed piece by PhD student Rebecca Castleman and undergraduate Abel Cover. This coming Sunday, April 26th, people will be gathering in New York from many countries around the world to insist that the nuclear states disarm. The second reason is that today is Patriots' Day. Professor Intondi's research is laced with patriots and is a reminder of our obligations as citizens, citizens both of this country and citizens of the earth. Mahatma Gandhi had a good explanation for why people remain silent in the face of manifest wrongdoing. He said, "You can wake a man who's asleep, but you can't wake a man who's pretending to be asleep." Professor Intondi's book is a gift to our country because it shows us people and a people who never went to sleep. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and before we get started, there are a lot of people I would like to thank for making this event possible. And of course, to start with Professor Elaine Scarry, but also Sarah Razor, Suzanne Smith, Stephen Beal, the Mahendra Center for Humanities, the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research, and my friends at Mass Peace Action. I'd first like to begin by telling you all how this project actually began, because it's 10 years in the making. In 2005, I made my first trip to Hiroshima and Nagasaki as a graduate student. And up to that point, all of my academic career and my career as a social and political activist had revolved around issues with civil rights and the Black freedom movement. When I went to Hiroshima in 2005 and met with atomic bomb survivors, I was so fundamentally changed, so angry, so full of guilt, that when I came back, I thought there has to be a way where I can start to combine these two passions of mine, which was trying to eliminate racism and doing something about the issue of nuclear weapons. And so I started with one simple question. What did African Americans think of dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And when I started asking colleagues about this question, over and over they told me, you're probably not going to find much. That African Americans were too busy, and understandably so, trying to gain their own freedom and equality, that they didn't have time to worry about nuclear weapons. Well, they were wrong. On June 6, 1964, a group of Japanese peace activists, writers, and atomic bomb survivors were on a world peace study mission. They had visited 5 other countries and then made their way to the United States. The woman in charge of arranging their visit in the United States was an amazing Japanese-American activist, Yuri Kachiyama, who we just lost last June. And when they were with her in Harlem, she said to them, while you're in the United States, what is it that you would like to do when you're here? And they all said the one thing they wanted to do most was meet Malcolm X. But at the time, Malcolm was traveling in the Middle East and in Africa, and while she was friends with him, she started writing letters to his office, thinking none of them actually got to him. And the last day, they were having a reception in her house, and there was a knock at the door. And when she answered it, there stood Malcolm. He came back. And he said to them, you have been scarred by the atomic bomb, but we've also been scarred in this country, and the bomb that hit us was racism. He then spent the day explaining to them how the war in Vietnam and how imperialism, colonialism, freedom, and peace were all interconnected. Because Malcolm understood what so many before him understood, that the issue wasn't about civil rights. The issue was universal human rights. And he knew how these things were inextricably linked. So my book, my research, examines those Black anti-nuclear activists who often connected the Black freedom movement here with liberation movements around the world and the struggle for peace and nuclear disarmament. Now, if we look at the scholarship with African American history in this country, for so long, textbooks and scholars have separated African Americans from the entire American narrative. February comes, and let's jam as much as we possibly can in for that 1 month, and that covers Black history. Look in our kids' textbooks, and there's a picture of Martin Luther King in a nice, neat little categorical box, or Rosa Parks, and that covers Black history. And I'm hoping that my research will stop that and will show people that the United States, the narrative of US history and the narrative of African American history cannot be separated. And this omission comes despite the fact that if you look at the urban concentration and population of African Americans, if there was ever a nuclear attack, you could argue that they're more in danger than any other group of people in this country. And so I started asking a series of questions. What role did it play for African Americans that the victims of the first nuclear attack were non-white? I asked, what role did it play in how African Americans were being treated in this country? And did that cause a more critical critique of US foreign policy in the Cold War? What role did the Black Popular Front and leftist groups in this country play in looking at this issue? And over the last decade, we have seen more studies in African American history examine the role of African Americans in US foreign policy, the role of African Americans in foreign affairs. And scholars have now concluded, in many cases, that African Americans have been involved in international issues and foreign affairs, dating back to the 30s and 40s, with a much more Pan-Africanist approach, whether it's looking at how they viewed the Italian invasion of Ethiopia or the Bandung Conference in Indonesia. But with a lot of these scholars and a lot of the scholarship, the general argument is that a lot of this internationalism ends in the 1950s when McCarthyism hits. That anti-communism was so horrible, so bad, that it severs any connections in the Black community with international affairs. And we don't see this reemerge until the Vietnam War, especially with Dr. King. Where my research differs from these scholars is that if you specifically look at the atomic bomb, if you look at nuclear disarmament and pivot around it, you will see that yes, in the 1950s, connections were weakened and groups were destroyed, but they were not, these links were not severed. And that actually they remain through the 1950s, into the 60s, 70s, 80s, and beyond. On August 6, 1945, when Harry Truman the military dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, instantly killing 140,000 people. And then on August 9th in Nagasaki, killing 70,000 people instantly. The majority of the American public rejoiced. Not because they were celebrating a quicker end of the war, but they wanted revenge for Pearl Harbor. Indeed, in this country, after Pearl Harbor, there was, as many scholars have noted, a genocidal race hatred against the Japanese that is unparalleled in our country's history, even more so than any hatred towards people of Middle Eastern descent after 9/11. The motto of the Marines at the time was, "Remember Pearl Harbor, keep them dying." General Joseph Stilwell wrote to his wife, "When I think of how these bow-legged cockroaches have ruined our calm lives, it makes me want to wrap Jap guts around every lamppost in Asia." Magazines and newspapers and every ad that we saw depicted the Japanese as being apes and vermin, cockroaches. And why? Make somebody less than human, make a group of people less than human, and it's easier to commit this mass violence against them. No different than what we did during the transatlantic slave trade. And we don't do this with other groups of people. If you look back, we're very careful to separate Germans from Nazis, Italians from fascists, but not Japan. Everyone was guilty. In fact, Gallup did a poll a week after the atomic bombings that showed 85% of the American public agreed with Truman's decision to use nuclear weapons. A Roper poll 2 months later showed that 22% of the American public wished that Japan hadn't surrendered so we could have dropped more nuclear weapons and killed more people. And in fact, no poll up until late October of 1945 ever showed more than 4.5% of the American public disagreeing or criticizing Truman's decision. But this wasn't the case in the Black community. This issue brought together artists and activists and journalists and clergy, musicians, athletes, and they didn't wait for any organized peace movement to begin. And it wasn't all monolithic. It wasn't all for the same reasons. Some looked at this and said we could just have a more peaceful world without nuclear weapons. Others, it was because they were involved in the Black Popular Front and tied this to colonialism. And others were looking at the atomic bombing through the lens of race. Now, some of this immediate criticism of Truman's decision actually predates the atomic bomb, because there was already, in many cases, an affinity with the Japanese people. It was the Japanese who publicly came out and said they were going to come to the aid of Ethiopia when Italy invaded. African Americans, in many cases, looked at Japanese internment and said, here are a group of people being put in prisons for no crime they committed, but just because of the color of their skin. Could this not happen to us? We know that there were Japanese agents actively here trying in the black community to get support. Of course, they went after Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam later. It's why in so much of their literature they refer to African Americans as the Asiatic black man. In fact, Malcolm X, when he was in front of the draft board, one of the things he did say was that he would be in favor of Tokyo. So we have this affinity already there in some cases. And so when I started to look at this, one of the first places I went was the black press. Papers like the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, Baltimore Afro-American, where African Americans in the 1940s were getting a lot of their information from. And overwhelmingly, what I saw were columnists and editors criticizing Truman's decision, referring to the atomic bomb as a ghastly war weapon, diabolical, warning it could end civilization. But I didn't want to just get what the editors and columnists were saying. I wanted to get a feel for what the general public was saying in the black communities. So I started going through letters to the editor. Now, to the students here, back then I didn't have the luxury of going on a ProQuest, putting in a couple keywords and hitting search. I was in the Library of Congress with microfilm, going through issue by issue, day by day, looking at every letter to the editor. And again, what I found was a pattern. Whether it was truck drivers or beauty shop owners or teachers or domestic workers, over and over, I saw criticism of Truman's decision to use the atomic bomb. Even prominent individuals started speaking out. Langston Hughes, writing in the Chicago Defender, was one of the first to publicly come out and ask what role race played in this decision. And he was valid to do so. President Truman was, if not the most, certainly one of the most racist presidents in US history. This is a man that if you read his letters to his wife, Bess, go through his personal diaries, go through his journals. He rarely refers to African Americans as anything other than the N-word. He brags in interviews that in his family, you got slaves as wedding presents to start out the housekeeping with. His mother openly supported the Confederacy, and when she first visited him at the White House, said she'd rather sleep on the floor than ever step foot in Lincoln's bedroom. And when he was told that the first atomic bomb was dropped, instantly killing over 100,000 people, the first thing he did was jump up and say, quote, "This is the greatest thing in history." And of course, this is the history that we don't learn in bad Gary Sinise films and bad David McCullough biographies, and so we have to dig around for this kind of history of Harry Truman. Zora Neale Hurston, who many argue was very apolitical throughout her career, was certainly not on this issue. Found a letter she wrote to her friend Claude Barnett, in which she referred to Harry Truman as, quote, "the butcher of Asia," and was visibly upset that more people in the black community were not rising up and speaking out against this issue. With the initial criticism, easily the most vocal came from the black left, most notably W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson. Du Bois, of course, had been to Japan previously, where he was lionized in many ways. He came out immediately and compared Truman to Hitler, calling him one of the greatest killers of our day. He said that the atomic bombing of a colored nation in Japan will set back other non-white nations and people for years to come. And a year later, Paul Robeson, in a massive rally of the Council on African Affairs in Madison Square Garden, 20,000 people there, Robeson immediately went after the colonialism issue, asking, where is the United States getting the material and the uranium to build nuclear weapons? And the answer to that, of course, was the Belgian-controlled Congo. I'm so thrilled that Steve McQueen, the director of 12 Years a Slave, has agreed to make a biopic of Paul Robeson because he is so forgotten in our history, such an amazing individual that my students so often have never even heard of. But this immediate criticism dramatically changed in the late 1940s with the Truman Doctrine. Long before George W. Bush ever said with us or against us, it was Truman who laid that line in the sand and said, you are with us or against us. And when that happened, one of the worst things you could be in this country was to be labeled black and red. And so yes, many groups fell mute. Others, like Walter White and the NAACP, the organization Du Bois helped found, made a dramatic shift to the right on this issue. Now, part of that was strategic. They felt that if they stopped criticizing foreign policy and stopped criticizing Truman, they'd be rewarded with civil rights, a bargain that never comes to fruition. Other activists in the black community, though, didn't look at peace as a bargaining chip because they saw where this was going. The arms race was on. The Soviets catch us in 1949 and create the atomic bomb. The United States gets the hydrogen bomb in 52, the Soviets get it in 53, and now it's a full-blown arms race. Not only that, we also had the breakout of the Korean War. And when the Korean War happened, President Truman, senators on both sides of the aisle, various members of our Defense Department all came out and publicly said we should use nuclear weapons in Korea, again on a people of color. And so activists in the black community said, no, we cannot remain silent and let this happen again. And at the same time, there was a peace movement reemerging, but it was out of communist bloc countries. And out of Stockholm came what's now known as the Ban the Bomb petition. Du Bois, Robeson, their wives, and others made a conscious effort to get signatures of the Ban the Bomb petition in this country and focused on the black community. They got over 2.5 million signatures. Marian Anderson, Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, all signed. Over 100 million signed around the world. And when we talk about a Ban the Bomb petition, especially if I'm talking to students today, it's a big deal. Because yes, we can go on Twitter, we can go on change.org in the safe security of our homes. In one click, we've signed a petition and done our activism. But it was a different story back then. To sign a petition like this, there were real consequences. People were physically beaten for signing this. They lost their jobs for signing this. Du Bois was brought up on charges of being a foreign agent of the US government. Not guilty, of course. And so to see this, that on the beginnings of the civil rights movement, and with all of this fear of anti-communism, to see the black community come together and millions of people willing to sign this petition saying they wanted to outlaw nuclear weapons is extraordinary. And where all of this started to go in the 1950s was what's known as the Sahara Project. So many things were happening in the early and mid-1950s at a very rapid clip. You have, of course, in 54, Brown v. Board. A year later, the heinous murder of Emmett Till. A few months after that, Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on a bus. What many people forget is in that same year was the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, the first all-Asian African conference that had a platform focused on eliminating racism and colonialism and nuclear weapons. And by the late 1950s, all signs, all roads were leading to Algeria and Africa. Now, I'm happy that some of my students are starting to discover Bayard Rustin from this film, Selma. Of course, Bayard Rustin, though, has such a long and rich history dating back to the 1930s of activism in this country, but so many marginalized him and iced him out of movements and literature because he was openly gay. And Rustin was such a key figure in this research. But Rustin, like so many others during this time, were kind of trapped because a lot of his work was with peace groups that were dominated by white middle-class pacifists, who in many ways carried their own prejudice, their own deep-seated racism that he had to navigate through. And so, in the late 1950s, with all of this happening, the French government announces they were going to test their first nuclear weapon. And where? The Sahara. At the same time, you have Kwame Nkrumah and an independence movement in Ghana. The people in Ghana were especially scared because of the fallout and what it could do to the cocoa industry. And as the Fourth Republic was falling, as Algeria was fighting for independence, Rustin saw all of this and said, this is it. Civil rights here. We have this fight for independence in Africa. Now we have the nuclear weapons testing. It's all coming together. It's all linked together. And his goal was to stop the French test. So he puts a group of activists together, both British and American, and heads to Africa to work with Nkrumah to try to stop this test. Not everybody was happy here. A. Philip Randolph was furious. He wanted Rustin here to work on civil rights. Rustin was trying to say to him, don't you see how these things are connected? And so Rustin goes there and, with various activists, tried multiple times to stop the French, but sadly, in February of 1960, the French government tested their first nuclear weapon in the Sahara. The continent exploded in protests. And while many would argue it's a failure on Rustin's part, I would say no, it was a success. Because he brought such attention to it that Nkrumah stayed with this issue and continued with World Without the Bomb conferences, nonviolent conferences, and there was so much pressure on France that eventually they did abandon their tests. Groups like SANE and Committee for Nonviolent Action, white pacifist groups now, were popping up all over, especially in this country in the late 1950s, early 60s. But what I saw was, overwhelmingly, the people that were endorsing their advertisements or appearing for them, the ones that were getting the biggest crowds and the most attention were always African American. Harry Belafonte, and of course, Dr. King. Now, Dr. King, we're starting to see, far too long in coming, but we're starting to see more and more of an examination of the radical side of Dr. King, especially that last year of his life. Scholars are writing more work that's looking at this in King's critique of capitalism and the Vietnam War. But again, what many argue is that King was speaking out against U.S. foreign policy starting largely with his Beyond Vietnam speech on April 4th, 1967. But if you look at this issue, nuclear weapons, you will see that actually he was critiquing this as far back as 1957, 10 years earlier. He came out in 1957 publicly saying he was against nuclear weapons and thought they should be banned. Whether it was speaking at colleges like Spelman or speaking to the black clergy, over and over he was saying the same things, that nuclear weapons needed to be banned, whether it was looking at the money being spent on them and how it could be better spent in his community, or simply saying, what does it matter if we're using the same water fountain if we're all dead from nuclear war? It makes no sense. And where was King learning this from? Well, his wife, mostly. Coretta was a long-seasoned activist dating back to her days at Antioch College. She had worked with Women's Strike for Peace and Women's International League of Peace and Freedom. But again, like Rustin, for black women working in these groups, they had to deal with the internal racism. There was a conference in Detroit for Women's Strike for Peace, in which black delegates, black women, were going to carry signs that said disintegration or desegregation. And the leadership, the white leadership of Women's Strike for Peace, were completely against this, did not want to merge these issues, saw these as single issues. And it was often Coretta who had to play peacemaker in between. And she was not alone. Lorraine Hansberry, who of course we know of Raisin in the Sun, was a feminist, radical, anti-nuclear activist. She famously went into a movie theater and saw a film called Hiroshima and came out and was caught saying, we must make sure this never happens again. We must stop this. And the last play that she wrote that never was produced was actually about a nuclear holocaust and the 2 survivors who made it out. And we see this continue throughout the Vietnam War because, again, multiple times the United States threatens to use nuclear weapons again on a people of color in Vietnam. The Black Panther Party, if you read Executive Mandate #1 that Bobby Seale read, you will see that it actually compares the black freedom struggle here with colonialism and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I talked to Bobby about this and asked him if this was conscious. He said, sure it was. Everything we did was put into an international framework. And indeed, Kathleen and Eldridge Cleaver are both invited by Japanese activists to go to Japan and speak about this issue. In the 1970s, when so many people were physically and mentally exhausted from the struggles of the 60s, this issue remains. There was what was called the Continental Walk for disarmament. It's supposed to be a peace march coming from all different directions in the country to meet in Washington, D.C. And for most areas, it was a simple exercise, except if you were participating in the southern leg, because the southern leg was dominated by African Americans who were beaten, arrested. There were death threats. So again, it was much, much more dangerous for them. Looking at Jimmy Carter, President Carter's ambassador to the UN, Andy Young, who was Dr. King's right-hand man for so many years. And it was Andy Young who was pressuring Carter not to build a neutron bomb. It was Andy Young who was so active in trying to make sure the white apartheid government in South Africa, who was secretly building a nuclear weapon with Israel, gave that program up. And of course, the height of this activism really came in the 1980s with President Ronald Reagan. Reagan came into office and he cut social programs by $140 billion, increased military spending by $181 billion. 12 million children were now officially under the poverty line. We famously know now that a packet of ketchup was now constituted the school vegetable during his time by the Food and Drug Administration. And he wanted to spend all this money on MX missiles and Star Wars and more nuclear weapons. And so a campaign emerged, especially in the black community, called Bombs Over Babies, to try to highlight and show the money that was being spent on nuclear weapons in the Reagan administration and how it could be better spent in their communities, again, connecting these issues. And it came from all directions. When I was writing this book and writing for the Huffington Post, I got a phone call from a gentleman who, he said, I've been reading your stuff on Huffington Post and following you, and we need to talk. I was involved in this in the 1980s. So we met, and he gave me a treasure trove of documents and interviewed him. And here was just an African-American librarian from Georgetown. Him and his wife at the time in the 1980s were saying, we care so much about this issue and we see these connections. Why is nobody speaking to us? Why are none of these white groups in our community talking about this? And they said, the heck with waiting for them. We'll do it ourselves. With a rotary phone and one flyer, they started the group Blacks Against Nukes, which grew to multiple chapters, hundreds of members. They were featured in Ebony and Jet and Essence magazine. They were asked to go to Japan and speak in Hiroshima. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things. I'm so thrilled that we're starting again to see the rise of a socially conscious athlete. I taught for 4 years at the same school that George Zimmerman went to, so I was knee-deep in all the Trayvon Martin organizing at the time, and I was thrilled to see LeBron James throw his hood up before anybody else and also speak out against Donald Sterling. It's great to see athletes wearing I Can't Breathe t-shirts and taking a stand when it's politically inconvenient for them, but doing it anyways. So I think we all remember where we were when Michael Jordan, at the height of his career, was famously asked why doesn't he do anything about sweatshop labor, and his response was because Republicans wear Nikes too. And when we think of socially conscious athletes, we of course think of Muhammad Ali and the '68 Olympics with Tommy Smith and John Carlos raising their fist. There was another group of athletes that were also doing this kind of work, and they were called Athletes United for Peace. Prominent black athletes from the NFL and Major League Baseball and the NBA coming together, some visiting Russia, all under the banner of trying to make peace. JoJo White of the Boston Celtics, Marianne Washington, the first African-American female to play on the U.S. national women's basketball team. Indeed, the whole Baltimore Orioles one year went to Japan, went to Hiroshima to meet with survivors. This was all leading to the June 12th, 1982 march, the largest march in some ways of any march we've had in this country's history, where nearly 1 million people came together against nuclear weapons. And in researching that march, again, the same friction was there in which white groups wanted to make sure this was a single issue. We only focused on nuclear weapons. And African Americans were saying, no, we want to tie this to what is happening in El Salvador and Nicaragua. We want to tie this to the money that could be spent in our communities. We want to tie this to racism. And Reverend Herbert Daughtry in New York put a group together, a United Black Front, threatening to have a separate march. There was all sorts of friction, and it took people like Shaka Khan and Harry Belafonte, Ozzie Davis and Ruby Dee to go in and try to mesh this together and finally get that leadership, half of that leadership, to be African American and to have a successful march, which they did. And so let me conclude here for a moment speaking about President Obama. President Obama was clearly the hardest part for me to write this book. As a historian, the worst thing I could do is predict something and then it not be true. So I had to be very careful not to do that in this book. But I also knew that I couldn't shy away from President Obama for such obvious reasons. As Elaine mentioned, the first thing to understand is how many came before him. Not just activists that I've briefly spoken about so far, but politicians like Ron Dellums, the Congressional Black Caucus, Shirley Chisholm, John Conyers, Jesse Jackson, who his 84 and 88 campaigns had a much stronger anti-nuclear platform than anybody else running, and he garnered millions of votes. President Obama's one of his biggest heroes, Harold Washington, mayor of Chicago, also staunch anti-nuclear activist. And President Obama was against nuclear weapons or writing or speaking out against them as far back as his days when he was a student at Columbia. He campaigned on an anti-nuclear platform. When he got elected, he continued to speak out against nuclear weapons. And very soon after his inauguration, he gave what is now known as the Prague Speech. The most anti-nuclear speech of any president in U.S. history, with possibly the exception of President John F. Kennedy's commencement address at American University in June of 1963, dubbed the Peace Speech. And I remember going to Japan, as I go every year, that year, and seeing the euphoria of the Japanese people, especially the survivors of the bomb. I was walking around at the ceremony on August 6th that year, and Japanese citizens were literally giving me stacks of letters saying, please go back and give these to your president and thank him for his Prague speech and what he's doing. And he continued on this trajectory, signing the New START Treaty to cut our nuclear arsenal by 30%, having 47 countries meet every 4 years and successfully getting Chile and Mexico and Argentina and Ukraine and others to turn over their nuclear weapons-making materials. That year in Japan, he had our ambassador, Ambassador Ruse, at the actual ceremony, first time any president did that. And in fact, in Japan, they actually started a campaign called the Obamajority campaign because they were so elated with what he was doing. There's always a but with Obama, right? It's the frustrating thing. We got health care, but we lost that public option. He acted on immigration, but he deported more people than any president in history. And this is more frustrating because on this issue, Obama didn't just stagnate, he actually went backwards. When he got reelected, we thought, okay, now that there's no more elections, he's going to make that dramatic shift to the left that John Kennedy did after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when he decided to go all in on civil rights and finally try to end the Vietnam War and make peace with Cuba and Russia and end the Cold War. And we saw President Obama put Chuck Hagel in a defense, and he had been a spokesman for Global Zero, so we said that was a positive step. We saw Caroline Kennedy as the ambassador to Japan. We said that would be a positive step. But then he announced that he was going to take money out of non-proliferation programs and put it into building more nuclear weapons. Now he decided to cozy up to this radical right-wing Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who will soon be in another week visiting the White House and speaking to a joint session of Congress. A prime minister who is now trying to edit textbooks in Japan to make sure that the atrocities the Japanese military committed are downplayed, wants to change the amazing peace constitution in Japan, wants to remilitarize Japan. expand the military base in Okinawa, which is already horrific in terms of violence and crime and rape, and in the trade agreement. So it's so troubling. And if that's not bad enough, Obama's new budget now calls for spending $1 trillion over the next 10 years on new nuclear weapons. And so you look at him and you say, well, he acted on Cuba, acted on immigration, and he just came out and said he wanted 2 years of free community college. Great. First question was, how are you going to pay for it? Well, $1 trillion on new nuclear weapons would be a good place to start. And so what can we learn from this? Well, one, I think the obvious is that we can no longer separate the narrative of U.S. history and U.S. Cold War studies from African Americans. The other is, so often in this history, we see African Americans in the abyss, in such misery, fighting for their own freedom. And when you see them wield their collective power to make a more peaceful world, it's extraordinary. We can learn how all these movements are connected. All the kids in the groups that I advise and work with on Black Lives Matter and all of these actions now, and explaining to them and showing them how these movements are connected. That the very leaders they look up to understood how these issues were connected. And so, I don't know what will happen in the next year and a half with President Obama. But I don't put that on him. That's on us. He never said, yes, I can. He said, yes, we can. And anything that he's done, he's been forced to act on. Immigrants forced him to act on immigration. The gay community forced him to act on gay marriage. And if we really want him to act on this, then we have to be out there forcing him to act on this issue. And he gets it. When he was running for president, he was asked, would Dr. King support you? He said, no, he'd be in the streets making me do what I said I was going to do. So he gets it. And I believe he knows how these things are connected. It infuriates me when people say, is he black enough? If through diplomacy he stops Iran from getting a nuclear weapon and therefore the U.S. or Israel do not bomb Iran and we're not in World War III, how many non-white lives just through that has he saved? And it's no coincidence that tomorrow I'll be back in D.C. marching with my students with the Justice League and the March to Justice against police brutality, and then Friday I'll be on a plane to march with Dan Ellsberg in Peace and Planet against nuclear weapons. They're connected. And so when we look at these issues through race and class, where money is being spent, then we understand that, like so many before him, Malcolm X was right. And he said it best, that the issue has never really been about civil rights for us. The issue has and always will be about universal human rights. Thank you. As many as you want.
Mm-hmm. You know, many of the people wrote for the Defender, the editor of the Afro-American, many of them were really part of that black left.
Yeah. But what is also interesting is that, and you'll see in the book that it's also black liberals. This extends beyond the black left, especially when I started looking at rank and file, because there is this issue of a lot of issues do kind of get severed with the black left in the 1950s, but not this issue. And so it really does go beyond that. George Schuyler, who certainly wasn't part of the black left, was openly criticizing writing, just going after Truman with everything he had on this issue. You see even people like Gil Scott-Heron, the last poets. I mean, you can go on and on with how many people, athletes I was speaking about that certainly weren't members of the Black Popular Front, right, or Black Left. So when you start examining this issue, it just starts, you see how it hits people in so many different ways. And again, it's not always for the same reason. For the Black Left, it really was in many ways about colonialism, and it was about a larger worldview, right? But for others, they were just looking at this and saying, and there were, during the Ban the Bomb petition, there were rank and file people in the community that were being told, you know you're signing this and it's communist related and this is propaganda. And there were people saying, they were coming out of churches and they said, I don't care what it is. I'm not communist. I don't care about communism or I'm just signing this because I don't want this bomb anymore. It's got to go. It's done. No more people of color being bombed. And this is what I was seeing over and over. So it really does go further than that. But certainly they were in big positions of leadership at various times. No question. No question. Any other questions? Yes?
Oh, okay. I'm interested in what kind of roles that you give to Pacific Islands and Pacific Islanders in your story, because nuclear weapons testing during the Cold War years is pretty much a Pacific issue. And I'm also interested in whether you think about the connection with the environmental activism and nuclear movement, and especially after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as the issues of nuclear weapons shifted to increasingly became environmental. And I'm very curious about your ideas on these 2 points.
Yeah, great questions. Thank you. Yeah, this is a huge issue. And in fact, I did a lot of research on environmental racism and nuclear testing, and I didn't put in this book, maybe different articles or another book. So in terms of nuclear testing, one thing that I would see is I would go into, again, Black reporters and see how are they reporting on this. And they were being invited to some of these nuclear tests and what their reactions were, and it was pretty horrific. The other piece, though, is the connection I saw was African Americans who then themselves were being used as nuclear guinea pigs, Black GIs who were also being put in the same, and they were seeing that connection there and saying we're the same way as what's happening here to tests in the islands. And so, and this ties into environmental racism as well, that for African Americans, whether they were Black GIs were being used as guinea pigs for nuclear testing and then not being treated or told about the effects, just like in the islands, and also the jobs that were available for African Americans in certain areas were so limited that the jobs were in nuclear plants and they were not giving any protective equipment. And I had wrote about this for Huffington Post, and I started getting phone calls from family members of Black GIs who had passed away as a result of this, had cancer. A.C. Bird's family had called me. They had read a piece I wrote about him. And I've been actively trying to get recognition for both what has happened in the Pacific Islands and then also for African Americans. And one of your own congressmen here locally has put forth a bill to try to get recognition and a medal for Black GIs or GIs in general that were used as guinea pigs. There's only been one formal apology for what was done, and that was Bill Clinton, but nobody really recognized it because he apologized the same day the OJ verdict came out, and everybody's a little preoccupied. So, but certainly, and also, environmental racism in terms of nuclear waste being dumped in certain Black communities, poor communities, all of that is relevant and ties into this. And Gil Scott-Heron had a great piece in his liner notes about this, comparing South Africa to what was happening in the Black community with environmental racism, also tying the Native American community in, looking at Africa and uranium depletion. That all ties into this, and I think you can also tie it into climate change, right? That I know there's been a lot of divest movement here on this with Harvard, but that there really is only 2 things right now that can eliminate us as a species, and that is nuclear war and global warming. So I see a real correlation there, yeah, with both. Yes.
Thanks very much for the presentation. I was just wondering to what extent people of color, whether that was a unifying kind of identity or whether it was relationships and alliances of political convenience? Because I've heard of Pan-Arabism and Pan-Africanism, but I haven't heard of a global pan-colorism. And it seems relevant, particularly now, at least on this campus. People of color as an identity has been re-emerging. So I wondered whether in your research you saw the origins of that much earlier in the way that these communities were speaking with one another.
Yes, and I think you can go back and see that, at least I saw that evidence again. You can, whether it is going back to Garvey and then all the way up with Ethiopia in 35, and you go in the Black Popular Front, of course, but you also see this throughout the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power movement. We certainly had this in the golden era of hip-hop in the 1980s. People were wearing African medallions, and you had Poor Righteous Teacher and African Bambaataa, Zulu Nation, and you had such an Afrocentric focus even in music at that time. That dates back to the Black Arts movement of the 60s. It was there. And so it's troubling that we have the disconnect there. Where I teach now, which is right on the border of DC, 50% of my students are African American, 49% are African from all different parts of the continent, and then 1% other. And there is such a disconnect there now, where my African students will tell me that they are taught in Africa to not associate with African Americans when they get here, that African Americans are lazy and they're not serious about studies, so distance yourself from them. And my African American students will say, we're not African, we're not going to relate to them, and saying something like African booty scratcher was a diss growing up, so we're not going to relate to that, and there's this disconnect. And then to have them realize that when a cop is beating you, he's not beating you because you're African American or African or from Ethiopia, he's beating you because you're black. And to get them to realize that, even within my African students, my Ethiopian students will say, oh, we're not from West Africa, we weren't enslaved, we're Ethiopian. So there's even a hierarchy there. And so, finally, last year, I remember I was in one class and we were talking about Emmett Till, and I believe it was when Eric Gardner, when the verdict came out, there was not going to be an indictment. And one of my students from Ethiopia stood up on her own, kids were crying, and she said, I finally get it. I get it that we're all black. Because in class they would refer to other, and they would say them, they, and not realize that connection. And so that anti-colonialism, that idea of the white West and who has the power, whether it's economically or militarily, and how these things are connected, that is something that we need. And you see that, a really good example of that, we can criticize governments now, was at the turn of the century in South America. And what you had in South America was in 2000, 2001, a Bolivarian revolution in which leftist leaders were being democratically elected. And with Chavez's oil revenue money, and you had Evo Morales in Bolivia, Coretta in Ecuador, Kirchner in Argentina, you had Paraguay, Lula in Brazil, they were speaking with one voice, using that money to pay off their debts to the World Bank and the IMF and say, nobody's going to tell us what to do. And for all of the horrible things, of course, that you can say of Gaddafi being a despot and a monster and all of that, of course, there are many of my African students that will still say the one thing he did want to do, though, and wasn't successful, is having the continent speak with one voice. And what power would that be then in terms of economics and so on and so forth? And so, I think there's a great film that's going to be coming out in the fall that's called Bound. And it looks at this issue of African students and African American students and how there's that disconnect there. So I think we really need to get back to that. And that has to come from all venues. We're seeing it in hip hop. I'm thrilled with Kendrick Lamar's new stuff, and we're starting to see, it addressed a little bit. So, yes.
Thanks, Vincent. Of course, in a half-hour presentation, you cannot include all of the granularity that's in your book. But I'm wondering, in your research, what was your sense of how much of this phenomenon mapped onto the left? Or to put it differently, did you not find some anti-nuclear weapons sentiment among black conservatives as well?
Well, again, George Schuyler, I would argue, is conservative, and he certainly was speaking out against this in his writings. But other than that, I didn't come across, and I did try to look at the entire spectrum, but I didn't come across a lot on the right that were looking at this, which was surprising, because quite frankly, obviously you don't want to lead your research, and the research leads you, but I was, in many ways, I think the bomb doesn't discriminate in some ways, in that it's, wanting to save humanity shouldn't be a right or left issue, but it's the way it broke down. But again, I'm looking at not all Democrats, not all Republicans. I'm looking specifically at the black community, as much as I possibly could in a large scope. And what I saw was, it wasn't so much about politics, it was they're looking at this issue through a completely different lens that others weren't. They were looking at this through a lens of race, through a lens of colonialism, and that did appear mostly on people that leaned progressive, that leaned on the left. But I don't think it was, you know, I did search, but I didn't see tons of black politicians that were on the right coming out or conservative journalists coming out. I didn't see that.
Well, we look at a litany of broken agreements, particularly with the U.S., because we had Saddam pretty much at bay, and then they came up with Yellow Cake while the UN inspectors were in there, and they trumped up the charges. And then they took out Saddam, or they took out Assad, they tried to take out Assad, and they took out Gaddafi, and he was playing ball, and they still wanted to get rid of him. So, and I think that has to do with colonialism and politics of that sort. But with regards to Obama's agreement with Iran, the same thing could happen there. If Iran so much as steps out of line, once they have the agreement and they start backtracking, then their backs are against the wall. And I'm not saying they need nuclear or should develop nuclear, but basically it's a form of nuclear blackmail in terms of the counter threat against them not developing it is the destruction of their potential of developing it in the name of stability within the region. And I would contend that the possibility is that the main destabilizer in the region from the point of view of nuclear weapons is Israel, because they have 200. And what are they there for? And isn't anybody complaining about that and telling them to get rid of theirs?
Right, so there's a couple of things to kind of unpackage there. And one is the obvious that it is, you have to look and say, okay, how can the US or Israel for that matter tell anybody what to do about nuclear weapons in the region when Israel's the only country that has them, the US the only one to actually use them. In terms of blackmail, you're right. My friend Dan Ellsberg always says that we use nuclear weapons all the time in the same way that if you rob a bank, you can put the gun up to somebody's head, you don't have to pull the trigger, and you can still get all the money that you want. I disagree with the argument that if a country has nuclear weapons, if Iran had them, then somehow that makes them more of a player or keeps them safer from an attack from somebody else. We've just seen too many close calls where we've just gotten lucky, like with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I don't agree that if everybody has them, then it'll just keep that's the solution. But in terms of Iran, we have to take it one step at a time. And right now, if this president, it's amazing to me. If any other president killed bin Laden and got Iran to not build a nuclear weapon through diplomacy, he'd be on money right now. So we have to see how this plays out. It's unconscionable that both Democrats and Republicans are trying to scuttle this in some way with an agreement in Congress. It really is, when the alternative is World War III. And I just think that it is something where I'll have students even that are very, I think for a lot of people, nuclear weapons is abstract. Nobody's going to be crazy enough to use them, even if people have them. And when I bring my students to Hiroshima and they actually see what it does, it changes them. It can't not change you. It's when people say it looked like a nuclear weapon went off, no, it didn't. There's nothing like it, nothing, when a nuclear weapon goes off. And it's why I really am pushing hard right now. I've been for a year pushing publicly in my writing, speeches, to have President Obama go to Hiroshima this year. This is the 70th anniversary. His ambassador Ruse said that President Obama would go before his presidency was over. The survivors are dying. We've lost 4 or 5 that I've known just in the last year or two. They're scared because they're scared that they're going to die and nobody's going to carry on their message. They have said he doesn't need to apologize. Just going there would make all the difference in the world. So now is the time for him to go. And so but I don't know what this Shinzo Abe and what this relationship is. And if he tells him, don't go, don't go, we know the right's going to call him weak and apologist. They do that now anyways. Who cares? But if he went, it would be absolutely extraordinary. And so I think we really have to push him every way we can publicly to say now is the time, this is the year for him to go. It would make a world of difference towards marching us in the right direction. Well, again, I'm not saying that Israel isn't a concern and that we shouldn't be, you know, that yes, they could be a destabilizing force in the region, of course. But I'm trying to change my country's policies and what my country is doing here and what I can, you know, whether it's my students. And so that's what I focus a lot of the activist side on. And then there's the research side as well. Yep.
Thank you. I learned a lot from this talk. It was wonderful. Appreciate it. I'm curious. I heard you as arguing that the solidarities between people concerned about nuclear weapons reacting to what happened in Japan and African Americans, that this was building on pre-existing solidarities between African Americans and Japanese people. But my understanding is that those solidarities had basically been fractured, and that had all fallen apart. Maybe 15 years earlier, people like Cyril Briggs had argued and seen, black people had argued that the Japanese Empire is an example to follow. But I had understood that during the very ideological 1930s that all that had crumbled. And so I'm wondering if that the dropping the bomb is actually an agent of pulling together solidarities rather than just a story of continuity. And then the question becomes, what makes that likely? And so one question I have is, I'm sympathetic to the argument you're saying that there's nothing like a nuclear explosion, but I'm wondering if you mentioned Ethiopia, if the use of chemical weapons on black people in Ethiopia in the 1930s, if that somehow readied black activists to make that leap of solidarity. And I'm curious, what are the origins of black concern about the nuclear weapon? Does it come from concern about chemical weapons or anything else like that pre-existing, or was this just something completely novel?
Okay, so the first set of your questions, yes, 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 yes. And so the first thing is, again, to be very clear, nothing is monolithic, right? So to say the black community, you have to be very conscious that, so for example, in terms of Japan, there was aspects where you had legitimately black agents working, again, whether it's the Nation of Islam or working certain groups to try to flip them, that was happening, okay? You also have, take for Pearl Harbor, for example. Up until Pearl Harbor, there was a split. There was, in some cases, there was an affinity that lasted, that endured past the 30s, that continued to go. And this was in part from Du Bois writing about the Japanese in black newspapers to how they were looking at colored nations and so on and so forth. But then when Pearl Harbor happens, there's a split. Some were saying, some of the black newspapers are saying, we are 100% committed. We are as far away from the Japanese as possible. Let's take their jobs. We want to have nothing to do with them. They're traitors. There was absolute split there. Again, others, though, were actually sneaking food into internment camps and were saying this could, again, happen to us and we need to be conscious of this. So there's never one, in terms of the Japanese specifically, one giant thing. And so even the bomb, when the bomb happens, yes, there are some that are looking at this when they learn about it. Even when the bombs drop, the newspapers start talking about African Americans that helped make the bomb. But even in that, they don't celebrate the bomb like other newspapers. What they say is, oh, our scientists are just as good as whites, and we can work with whites, and we're as smart as them, and so we should be rewarded with this, right? And African Americans, soldiers coming back and saying, well, now we're going to be rewarded with civil rights. We put on the uniform. Wrong. And so they start thinking differently about things. Well, what were we fighting for? And so I didn't see one thing. For some, again, black left, they immediately started tying this to colonialism. They immediately started saying, where's the uranium coming from? Who possesses nuclear weapons? Could this be used on other countries now, on non-white countries? Africa's going to be next, and so on and so forth. For others, they were just saying, especially I started going through the black clergy. I started looking at different pastors' Sunday sermons, and they were all just saying, this is madness. We don't have enough religion to stop this. This is insane. The genie's got to be put back in the bottle. So they were just looking at it through this kind of apocalyptic narrative, if you will. Langston Hughes, and again, he wasn't alone, started looking at this and going, wait a minute here. What was the motivations here? Was it truly to end the war? Or was there something else here? We know that didn't end the war. It was actually Russian entry that ended the war. So, and that's when race starts being talked about. And Langston Hughes starts asking these questions. Hey, why is it being dropped on people of color? And what role did race play? Then it got other people thinking, going, well, okay, wait a minute. Well, now maybe, now we're threatening Korea again? Now we're threatening Vietnam? Seems to be a pattern here, right? Testing a nuclear weapon in Africa? Wait a minute. Why is it always non-white peoples? So I think there isn't just one answer to say that. So I think you're right in kind of looking at all those things. Yeah, those are all in different aspects. It's just trying to look at different in terms of their economic income. Rich African Americans, poor, were they living in the country, were they in the military, were they, I tried to look at as many of that as possible to try to really get a larger scope of, or a larger view of where they were at.
I wondered if you could just clarify something you said right at the beginning. You were talking about, I think, the unique demonization of the Japanese, and you said, we don't do this to other people. I don't know if you meant at the time we didn't, because I immediately see the parallel to the contemporary demonization of Arabs.
Oh, yes, but...
And so forth.
Yeah, as I mentioned, yes, we of course did this during slavery. We, of course, did this after 9/11. What I'm saying is in terms of especially during wartime, even the hatred towards people of Middle Eastern descent after 9/11 doesn't compare to how bad it was during Japan. In fact, it's funny, I have people, colleagues, students, friends that are reading my book, and they'll say that they're talking to a grandparent. And they'll say to a grandparent, wow, we really had this hatred towards the Japanese. Of course we did. They should have been bought. There's still this hatred. And when you go back and look at the media, the pictures during this time, of course, John Dower's done great work on this, you see that we're not doing this to the Germans and to the Italians at this time. We're simply not. But the Japanese, the whole country is guilty for this. We're not separating. We're not saying there's innocent civilians. No. They're fanatics. And again, their military was horrible. Of course it was. It was brutal, one of the most brutal militaries. It had to be stopped. But of course, it was stopped before the bomb was dropped. They were already defeated.
You mentioned study of clergy's sermons, and I'm curious if, I'm sure there is, more to say about the black church and its role then and up to this point.
Yeah, well, again, in the black church back in the 50s and 60s was not, in many cases, preaching this ridiculous prosperity gospel that we see in many churches today. Pastors during the civil rights movement or before that were not caring about what rims you had on your car and wearing Armani suits. They were preaching a social gospel. They were preaching a gospel that to be Christian was to help the poor. That was your duty. And so it was very different in many cases. And they were seeing this again, and they were saying that we're just taking one evil and replacing it with another evil. That's what we're doing. That again, we don't have enough. I don't have enough faith to stop this. And looking at this kind of again, and this could end civilization. Is this it? This is the weapon? And then looking at it again, I would see black pastors mentioning race and saying, what role did race play? Questioning the parishioners and saying that race discrimination is just no excuse to use something like this. So I would see it, repeatedly. And then. I didn't see it so much in terms of 90s and so on and so forth after that, but it was early on that you saw it in the black church. Now, that's not to say it's not continuing today in some aspects of the black church. Again, I'm going to be with Reverend Herbert Daughtry next week, so there are certain, but there's also other churches that we see today that are much more concerned about wealth and things of that nature, and so I would say we need to move away from that and more towards focusing on stuff like this. I was thrilled to see, quite frankly, when we're talking about clergy, to see Pope Francis come out so vehemently against nuclear weapons now and see what he's willing to speak out against. Yes, sir.
So I see that your book and workings in general seem to be on how knowing about the usage of nuclear weapons seems to really gather up and rally the black community to realize that these issues are coming together and they need to reach out to the other side and such. But is there also another side to the dichotomy that you saw, that in countries that have been affected by the atomic bomb, by those in Japan, somehow saw that, looked back at racism over here in America and got out to the community there and went to their other side of the issue and thought about civil rights there as a consequence of what happened to them as well?
In terms of Japan and civil rights, I would say no, in the sense that even now, my students in America, when we go July 30th to August 11th every year, we partner with Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto. And my students, my Japanese students who love hip hop and they'll have shirts of Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali on, if you talk about racism now, they don't know that there's still this kind of institutional structural racism going on in our country, okay? That's number one. The other piece is Japan also, atomic bomb survivors, if we're gonna look at, face their own discrimination. That's where the comparison is. that to be a victim of the atomic bomb, now you had the physical deformity. There was what's called atomic bomb disease, where doctors didn't know why you were dying of cancer and radiation. And you also represented defeat. So for a lot of people, they were being shunned and they were facing discrimination in the same kind of way, not as dramatic as the structural racism in this country towards people of African American descent. So there's that comparison, but Japan certainly was not even after this, there was issues of, even today, you can look at how they viewed blackface and how that should be viewed and certain things of that nature. I think Spike Lee's film Bamboozle wasn't even allowed to be shown there. And so there's a lot of issues there with race that still need to be addressed when you're looking at Japan and how Asia also addresses this. So I didn't see this thing where Japan was really big on civil rights and knowing what was going on in the United States and fighting for civil rights here. But that said, just a couple weeks ago, there was a great article, I believe in the New York Times, Washington Post, about another Japanese man who was going, he marched at the original Selma March, and he marched again this time in the 50th anniversary. Like I mentioned, Yuri Kachiyama was certainly an amazing activist, so, but I didn't see it was huge on the radar in Japanese culture.
Go ahead. Yeah. A couple times you mentioned that white peace groups had a divergence with black peace activists on the, and what I understood you to say was on the question of should nuclear abolition be a single issue or should it be linked to racism? Should it be linked to foreign policy? Should it be linked to other social issues? Then you said that those divergences were resolved. And how were they resolved, on what basis? And did, in fact, the white peace groups broaden their agenda as a result of that dialogue, or what was that discussion?
Yeah, so for example, SANE. All right, so SANE emerges as a huge largely white middle-class pacifist group that was active. And SANE realizes that they have a problem. SANE realizes that they don't have a lot of black members and that there are a lot of rank and file or members in leadership that don't want to merge these issues, and they're adamant about it. And there's other members in SANE that are saying, we have to merge these things together. Like, do you not see that there are these connections here between civil rights and peace? And so there's this kind of back and forth going on, and I read the letters going back and forth, and it gets resolved in that I think it's multidimensional, that some are just saying this is the right time, the right thing to do. I think others are realizing, though, that again, it's prominent African Americans that are bringing more to the fold, that they're bringing more people into this, and they're saying, even strategically, this isn't a smart move to just completely isolate African Americans in the black community and say, no, we shouldn't be working with them. So I think there were a couple reasons for it, and you start to see it happen. But again, there were those that were adamantly against this and were really hell-bent on not making sure that this, and again, for some, earlier on, there was this prejudice as well. It wasn't just a singular issue. I did see flat-out racism in some of these letters going back and forth and things like that, or we don't want to be as radical. But again, this isn't new, right? We can go back to slavery, and you have the gradual Quaker approach of let's wait, we have our own prejudice. Then you got the John Browns, right? You got the John Brown type that's willing to die for it, right? So there's always been that kind of some that are willing to only go so far in the white community when it comes to these issues, and others that are willing to go further. And this is just no different.
Isn't the balance saying partly about anti-communism, the broader issues, position linked, saying with the left, and a more single issue position is an attempt to protect?
Yep, in some ways, yes. But even that also happens in the black community, though, because when Dr. King begins to now speak out about Vietnam and things in the late 1960s and still is combining these issues, Rustin, in King's views, now essentially become inverted, right? Rustin now is against tying this to the Vietnam War. He's afraid of that communism piece of it. A. Philip Randolph, again, same kind of thing. And King is going all in. In fact, King gives his Beyond Vietnam speech. He's completely called out. He's just, NAACP condemns him, and Rustin comes out against him. And what does he do on April 15th? He doubles down. He goes to New York with hundreds of thousands of people and marches. And again, he says a week before he died, or a month before he died, we are fools if we are only worried about the lunch counters we're integrating, but yet not the world and protecting the world in which we integrate. It doesn't make any sense. And Coretta on the same day, of course, was in San Francisco with 75,000 others. So, but yeah, I think the communism piece and protecting that is a piece of it. But that also goes with the Truman Doctrine and then Reagan Doctrine, this constant drawing this line in the sand of with us or against us. And if you're not, you're on the other side.
Vincent, as you can hear from the steady array of questions, I think we could go on for hours, but this has been a wonderful talk, and we all thank you.
Thank you, and I'll stick around.